This is the Nikon Z-FC, and sorry it's been a while since I posted my last video. Because of the global chip shortage, all I could find to review was an old film camera from Nikon. No, of course this is not an old film camera. This is a brand new camera from Nikon that is designed to look like an old film camera, and which seems like a trendy thing nowadays. And normally I'm not a fan of modern product designs that mimic the old analog styling, because I've always felt like they're pretending to be something that they're not while sacrificing function for fashion. But when I try these sort of cameras, I almost always end up liking them, because you see, photography is a very tactile experience, and we live in a world where we can fit cameras inside our phones that are as thick as a pencil, but having these physical dials with the numbers written on them and being able to visualize the settings and being able to change them one at a time, it's very refreshing and fun. So these sort of designs actually end up improving the usability and functionality rather than sacrificing them. So which is also why I like a lot of the Fuji cameras as well, and they're incredibly satisfying and fun to use. And of course, this isn't Nikon's first attempt at something like this. They tried it with the DF, and the DF was a full-frame DSLR, and I personally really liked that camera, but it wasn't a huge success because it was a bit too expensive for what it was. And although it was the camera that was only supposed to look like an old camera, some of the internals were just as old as the way the camera looked. And now we have the FC. And the FC, unlike the DF, is a crop sensor mirrorless camera, so it's a lot smaller and lighter. And also, unlike the DF, it is quite affordable. It's about $960 US. So it's supposed to appeal to a lot wider range of audiences instead of just being a collector's item. And its price falls right in between what I think are its closest competitors, the Sony a6400 and the Fuji X-T30. So far, so good then. So should you buy one? Well, let's find out. In terms of hardware, I think it looks pretty nice. I like the way the viewfinder looks. I like the way the dials look and feel. I like the little screen that shows your f-stop number. When I first saw the pictures of this camera, I was a little worried that it might look a little too cheap and tacky, but I'm glad to say it looks a lot better in person, and personally, I think this is a better looking camera than the X-T30. I mean, it looks like a $960 camera, not a $9,600 Leica, let me put it that way. But overall, I'm a fan. I'm a fan of how this looks and feels, and I think they did a good job. And on the inside, this is basically the same camera as the Z50, which is about $100 cheaper. But what you don't get on the Z50 is this fully articulating touchscreen, which I think is the way the market's moving to. Some people hate it, some people love it, but you can't deny that it's useful. And Canon's done this for years, and even Sony's moving to this with all their new cameras, and even Fuji went to it with the X-T4, and Nikon's, I guess, just following the trend. And it feels surprisingly sturdy and nice. It's got a nice weight to it. It clicks when it's at 90-degree angles, and of course you can flip it over like this if you really want to pretend like you're shooting film. Some of the things that I'm not so thrilled about, the whole mid-section of the camera, it just feels a bit plasticky, and I don't want to say it's bad, but like compared to the top portion of the camera, it does feel very plasticky and definitely not as nice. And especially the back buttons here, they just don't feel as nice as the top buttons and dials. And the bottom battery compartment door, this doesn't feel very durable. And it's probably also worth mentioning, B&H and DP Reviews say that this is weather sealed. But I also read a Tech Radar article saying that it's not. And Nikon website doesn't specifically mention weather sealing, so I'm not entirely sure if it is weather sealed. It might be or may not be. But I think, just like with any cameras, as long as you use it with caution, you'll be okay. There's also no sensor stabilization, although that's quite understandable on such a small body. The ISO dial has a push-to-turn type of lock, which I hate, and the way the shutter speed dial works is kind of interesting. It has the same lock mechanism as the ISO dial, but it only works when you're switching to different modes. Meaning, when you're normally adjusting the shutter speed, the lock doesn't work, but when you get into different modes, like the third step mode or the bulb mode and such, it locks you in place so you don't accidentally change the settings. I liked that idea until I actually started shooting, because sometimes I'll be looking at the viewfinder and turning the shutter speed dials, and sometimes I would accidentally turn it a little too much or turn it the wrong way, and all of a sudden I'm locked into the third step mode and I can't turn the dial, and that annoyed me time to time. And I don't know why the lock only works to keep you in the other modes but doesn't stop you from leaving the manual mode. Also, unlike Fuji, Nikon doesn't have any new lenses with a dedicated aperture ring, so the only way to change the aperture on this camera is with this front dial, or the back dial, depending on how you set it up. But which is fine, which is completely fine, but compared to the ISO dial and the shutter speed dial, it just feels a bit disconnected, because, you know, like, it's nice having all the dedicated dials for everything, but then for the aperture, you just get this little thing. And speaking of lenses, Nikon's obviously spread themselves pretty thin with all of their new full frame cameras and the Z50 and now this. It is the same lens mount, but because the camera looks so different than all the other cameras that they make, it does look a bit ridiculous when you put some other Z mount lenses on it. Right now, the 28mm f2.8 is the only lens that looks like that was meant to be used with this camera. And if you're buying a camera like this, you obviously care about how your camera looks. So in that sense, you might be a little limited with your lens selection. And perhaps my biggest complaint, I think the DF had the same issue as well. You can't access auto ISO on the dial. You have to do it in the menu. I don't know why they didn't add auto ISO into one of the notches on the dial, but to turn on or off auto ISO, you always have to get into the menu, go to the ISO sensitivity settings, and then change the auto ISO settings in there. And once you're in auto ISO, this dial is completely useless. It doesn't change anything. Now, like I mentioned, since this is mostly the same camera as the Z50, it has the same 20 megapixel sensor and the same processor. And don't quote me on this, and I think this is still the same sensor from the D500, which is a good sensor, but quite old now. So I'm not going to focus too much on image quality here, but what I've seen, I've been happy with so far. The dynamic range is pretty decent for a crop sensor camera, and the noise wasn't too bad in the raised shadows, and more than good enough for casual use and some light adjustments, and the colors look pretty good as well. The standard profile seems to be a tiny bit on the cooler side, but the photos edit really well, and I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. All the photos you see in this video were taken with the 28mm f2.8, by the way. Now, there's one more difference from the Z50, and that is the upgraded autofocus. And because I haven't tried the Z50 in person, I can't really comment on how different it is. And because they share the same sensor and the processor, it's probably not that different, but they did add full-time eye autofocus in video mode. So if you're going to be vlogging a lot with this camera, that's a very useful feature to have. Also, while shooting photos, the autofocus seemed quite reliable. Not like unbelievably good, but surprisingly reliable. I think that's the right way to put it. The human and animal eye autofocus worked pretty well even while moving, and what surprised me was how good the tracking was. The square just stuck to whatever I pointed it at and wouldn't let go, to a point that was almost hilarious. And this camera has a pretty good burst rate as well. It can shoot up to 11 frames per second, and when I first heard the shutters, it sounded a little slower than 11, and apparently 11 frames per second only works with 12-bit RAW, and in 14-bit RAW you can shoot up to 9 frames per second. So with its autofocus, it actually has a very good potential for being a great sports camera. But with some caveats. I noticed it still has a single UHS-1 slot, and the buffer isn't very big either. It fills up quite quickly after about 3 or 3.5 seconds of shooting bursts with either 9 or 11 frames per second. And after the buffer fills up, it takes about 11 to 12 seconds to completely clear the buffer. Now, that's completely fine for shooting casually, and in no way I'm saying that you can't shoot any sports or wildlife with this camera. But if that's something you do regularly, then there are better options out there. The FC also uses the same battery as the Z50, the ENEL25, that is rated at 300 shots per battery. But as I always say, these ratings are pretty meaningless. After shooting for half a day, the battery was still mostly full. And I wouldn't be surprised if it can't get more than 1,000 shots per battery depending on how you shoot. I always think the video is a more accurate way to test the battery life because there's a lot less variables. And I'm glad to say it did very well. With a single charge, I was able to shoot 4K videos for almost exactly 2 hours, which is pretty good for a small camera like this. And speaking of video, the FC's video specs are pretty decent as well. Again, nothing extraordinary, but decent. It can shoot 4K up to 30p without crop, 1080 up to 120. To get into the movie mode, you just need to use this little switch under the shutter speed dial, which is very simple. It still does have the 30-minute recording limit, which kind of sucks because a lot of the Sony cameras in this price range don't have that anymore. But what's good is I didn't experience any form of overheating while shooting 4K videos. On the side, there's micro HDMI and there's a microphone jack, but no headphone jack, so some video shooters might be disappointed there. But there's USB-C charging, which can be used to charge the camera while shooting video as well. So overall, although this is meant to look like an old analog camera, it's definitely not lacking any modern amenities either. So I think that's very nice. So the Nikon Z FC, what do I think about it? Well, I see two types of people being attracted to this camera. One is the type of people who want the analog experience without having to deal with the inconvenience of dealing with film. And second is perhaps some newer photographers who are going to be buying this purely based on the way it looks, which is fine. If you're a new photographer, it's important to buy a camera that you might want to carry around with you all the time. And if the way this looks inspires you to do that, then I think that's a money well spent. So who is this camera not for? Well, before I tried this camera, I thought this would be a much more niche camera that only looks cool, but it seems to be quite comparable to its competitors in terms of its features and the price range. But I guess if you don't care about the looks, then there are cameras with bigger grips that are much more ergonomic. And if you like to use a lot of different lenses, like I said, the selection is pretty limited right now. And of course, you can always adapt different lenses, but would you really want to put a big and bulky adapter on this camera? I sure don't, but that's entirely up to you. But other than that, I actually like this camera a lot more than I thought I would, and I enjoyed shooting with it, and especially for the price, I don't see many deal breakers. There are some minor issues with the interface, but if you just kind of slow down and be patient with it, you'll learn to live with it, you'll get used to it pretty quickly. And I think that's the way this camera is meant to be enjoyed. It's not meant to be taken too seriously. It's all about slowing down and having fun with it and taking your time to craft your shots, and you know, looking cool while doing it is just a big bonus. So that's going to be it for me today. Thank you for watching. And if you have any more questions about the camera, just leave a comment down below and I'll try to get to them all. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.